Hey everybody, so today I am losing my voice. Sorry about that. But this is our annual What is Coming Up in 2026 in the semantic data and AI space. And this is something I've been doing with Kurt Cagle and Alison Morrison for 5 years. So I made a little playlist if you want to go through and listen to all of these throughout the years. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and see what might be on the way in the next coming year.
These predictions are wild and crazy because the world is wild and crazy in those spaces right now. So we were talking a little bit even before I hit record about like the state of just what does it mean to be in this space now as far as like getting a role in a job, because there was an article, or I shouldn't say an article, it was a LinkedIn post that was talking about how there's so much demand for ontologists, and yet there's not enough ontologists out there. And I commented on it, and a whole lot of people agreed by like upvoting
Yeah.
it that actually there's a whole lot of ontologists out there, a whole lot of them that are on the market now because of some of these big layoffs. So where's the disconnect? And, we were just even talking about like some of the folks that we work with, and we know they get into, and not just ontology, but a semantic like kind of project, and then it falls apart or it loses funding. And so we then hear, well, but you need all this for AI to work well. So what's going on? It's a very strange space. So, and maybe I could just summarize what I said in my comment, because it's my opinion on it, which is, I think most businesses don't know what an ontologist is. I don't think they know what a knowledge graph is. They hear their buddies and the news and other resources saying, "Hey, knowledge graph in RAG or graph RAG," and nobody knows what the heck any of that stuff is. And so they're looking for a unicorn. And so maybe that's why a lot of ontologists, or again, just people in the semantic space, not even just saying ontology, are struggling to connect with those jobs. Because I know I was talking to Aaron. We all, I think, know Aaron. How do you say Lehart? Yeah. He was talking about like, okay, looking at jobs now for, some of the stuff that he works on in the ontology world and even taxonomy world. You get halfway down into the job description and he's like, yep, do that, do that. And then it gets into like Python and AI and like all these other things that are not, don't get me wrong, there's some that are like a knowledge engineer has like a lot of overlap between semantics and AI, but it's not the norm. So maybe that's the disconnect, at least from my opinion. But I'm curious, what about you guys? You guys are out there. What are you seeing?
There's a bit, well, there's a couple factors. One is this knee-jerk reaction about, oh my God, I've just spent my whole budget on AI and the results are crap. And we need something out there, and there's a
But Kurt, it's
small group of
magic. It's magic. You don't
oh
need to
yeah, I
ask.
know. It's definitely magic. There's no question about that. Magic and unicorns and pixies and fairy dust will get you a long, long way into building good enterprise applications. Um, but I also think that it's something where I see two factors. First is somewhere along the line, someone got the Palantir spiel and
Mhm.
they've gone whole hog into ontology. I have no idea what ontology. From what little I've seen of their platform, it's kind of a head scratcher as to exactly what it is that they're talking about because it's not RDF. Um, but there is some kind of at least basic awareness of graph and it's enough of a player in that space that when they talk about ontology, it's suddenly big. Um, but I also think that there's a fair number of people. Gary Marcus, is one that comes to mind. Uh, what's his name? Funk. Um,
Jeffrey Funk.
Jeff Jeffrey Funk. That's
We're
right.
all reading the same,
Um,
people.
yeah. We are, and most of them are saying, okay, you need to have foundation. You need to have something that's solid, that basically provides a ground truth. You have Jan LeCun coming in, and a little bit different argument, but Jan's basically been saying for a while now, hey, we need to have world models. And some of that's some of that's from the perspective of Jan is still very much a tried and true AI, neural nets everywhere and things like that. And I don't think he'll ever quite be part of the symbolic side of things. But I also think that he has been talking a fair amount about, yes, you need to have a way of being able to model ground truths in reality. And you can't do that with a language model. A language model is opinionated. A language model basically is, I have what amounts to a giant narrative superspace. And, depending upon what kind of training data that you're talking about, that narrative space is all over the map, is not necessarily reflective of truth. It's just a way of being able to describe language or to produce language.
And yeah, and I think like it's so frustrating when I hear people talk about even a ground truth of, well, this information is, it's peer reviewed, or it's, from a authoritative source like a government or something like that. We are human, and humans make mistakes, if not outright lie. That happens too. And you can be lying from omission, you could be lying without knowing you're lying because it's just your understanding of a situation, right? But when we talk about ground truth, I think there's a lot of landmines in there too, and world models. Whose world model, right?
Well,
Like that's the other thing.
That's the total thing about world model. It's another buzzword, and you've got 8,000 startups out there that need to do something in 2026 to make themselves stand out, and they're talking about world models, and they're talking about generating these statistically. And you're going to have the same mediocrity and unpredictability that we've always had with that monolithic approach. And so we're going to have to deal with the buzzword. And going back to who's hiring whom, the tendency is to sort of think about the data science teams first, and who inside the data science circle is going to be familiar with ontology, because that's what everybody's familiar with. So we're from a different tribe, essentially. It's a tribal thing inside these organizations. And I always point back to the master algorithm author who talked about the machine learning tribes, and the symbolists were one of the tribes. But it's sort of like it's a leap to hire ontologists from our tribe if what they're used to is just this one monolithic thing.
Or like what I've also seen is talking to a very prominent company out there in the world. They're hearing all of these different diverse perspectives on graph itself. Do you need an ontology? Can you do graph rag? Do you want to do graph space rag? Where do you do that? How do you need entity resolution, or don't you? Can you what's the difference between a semantic layer and a semantic search and a knowledge graph? Like there's all of these things that are piling in, and talking to this one specific entity, what I teased out was, who was stating this claim? Who was stating that claim? And it all comes down to vendors. The vendor does this, and therefore that is their worldview.
Yeah.
So it's it's going back to no RDF. We need RDF. No property graph. Like, use the right tool for the right job. And sometimes you can use both tools, right? Like, it's so ridiculous that we have to do this, but it's causing a lot of confusion. That's for sure. And I think that you're right. Like, it's how do you sell the buzzword? Sometimes even the job postings that you have are kind of part of that buzz, like, ooh, they're hiring an ontologist. Now we know what they're doing over there. Meanwhile, what is that ontologist doing? Is that poor person stuck on a team all by themselves doing, like, again, no disrespect to taxonomy work, but like that they share pieces, right? They're not the same thing. Did somebody hire an ontologist and now they're actually looking for a taxonomist? Are they bringing somebody in that they think is going to do, and there's all these different types of graphs. And I'm not talking about RDF versus LPG. I'm talking about, are you doing a analytics graph? Are you doing a enterprise knowledge graph? Are you doing a verification graph? Are you doing a semantic query expansion graph? Which one? Right? And there's all of these different things that there's so much specificity to what we do. A knowledge graph is no different now, I feel, than saying, yep, I have an API. Cool. What's it do? Right? And like, not everyone is an API expert either, right? And that's where our expertise is still very much needed. And APIs are incredibly important, especially now that we have MCPs floating around, but that's maybe a topic for later in this conversation. But like, it's in a way, it's a good thing. It's like, yep, it's another tool in the toolbox. But it's like the Swiss Army knife. You don't know which part to use if you're not familiar with it.
Well, I mean, getting back to the question about, where are the ontology jobs out there?
Yeah.
And, I think part of that, and again, there's a survivor bias that goes on here, because I'm seeing largely those things that, people are coming to me on. But your comment earlier about the but before we started recording, your comment about the fact that you have a lot of companies that are now basically saying, okay, we can't afford an ontologist, whatever that is, and we really just need someone to kind of hold our our I'll use the term not completely dismissively, but our baby taxonomists, so that they understand
Upskilling the
what's going on.
taxonomies.
Upskilling the taxonomists, yes.
Yeah.
And which is fine. I think that if you're dealing with taxonomy, you're already dealing with one portion of what an ontologist should do.
Yeah.
I make it a big point of saying, okay, an ontologist is simply another kind of information architect. It's a specialization, but if you want to know where it fits into the grand scheme of things, think about your organization in terms of an IA. And an IA has, or a data architect, the terms tend to be used interchangeably. But in both cases, what you're talking about is you need someone to be able to come in and think and work at the analytics level, but you also need to have people that are able to work with the tool sets and the tools that are out there. And those are two different things. The tools that you need from an IA perspective, for the most part, I can do a lot of that with something like Claude. And that's become a fairly indispensable part of my toolkit. But realistically, what ends up happening is that no one really understands, well, there's these query languages we're talking about, and now there's this spooky, scary thing in the background called SHACL that we're having to, we're hearing strange things about, and I feel a little responsible because I'm the one that keeps talking about the spooky, scary things. But regardless, I think that what we're seeing now is organizations that need help, but they don't necessarily want to commit to a full-time ontologist,
Yeah.
primarily because, like any architect, there's someone who basically comes in, does a design role, and then says, okay, once we have the design role, their utility in that particular scenario drops off pretty dramatically. You don't
You
need
say
a
that, but it
full-time
takes like years
ontologist.
and years and years sometimes to get to that
It
point. To be
can,
clear to the
yes.
audience.
I'm not disagreeing with that too.
Yeah.
I think that it definitely can. But again, I think that may be partially my own bias from what I've seen. We're at a stage where I think that organizations are going to start growing their own ontologist, but they won't necessarily recognize that what they're growing is an
Yeah.
ontologist.
Yeah.
I'd only say that God, I wish people would want to solve the big problems rather
Yeah.
than just tackling analytics or content management or trying to do a little data management with a bit more of the inventory that they have. Just think about the fact that you can take one method and solve the problem over and over again rather than just focusing on one little space and looking for your keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is. You
Yeah.
don't get the benefit unless you have the big picture solution and you're doing things the right way to get to that solution. You're not going to have the benefit. And we talk about supply chain integration. I mean, that's even harder than enterprise wide. So
Yeah.
when are people going to wake up and realize, this is the way this has to be, and let's just put our shoulder to the wheel and do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good. So I've been struggling with this, I think almost my whole career. So I wonder, I mean, AI is just compounding it, right? So I've been working in Knowledge Graph for 18 years this year. And I know that pales in comparison to the two of you, but it's
That's
nothing
about right.
it's something, right? Like I've been
Yeah.
doing this for a decent amount of time. And
Yeah,
AI has
I've
been
been doing it for about 20 because I remember I remember starting to really get into RDF about 2005. So
yeah,
it's not
and
18 years. You've been doing it. You've been doing it as long as I have.
wow, now I feel like
I'm the junior
what?
one.
But AI has always been a part of the graph space, I feel. Like even if it's more traditional machine learning, right? Because like the entity resolution and some of these other things that just come into the mix with knowledge graph. But one thing that has changed over the last 2 years, so mostly since, ChatGPT came onto the scene, was it used to be going in and knocking on the door. Hey guys, there's this graph thing and look what it does. It's really cool and it does these things and it's really beneficial and it actually, saves you time, saves you money. It, unearths things that you could never find otherwise. That kind of narrative that we still use a lot, but now I'm not the one knocking on the door anymore. Now I'm sitting in my office and I hear people banging on the door. We need this ontology. We need a knowledge graph. What's that? And I'm like, wait, can you tell me what your problem is first? Like, hold up a minute. And it's a weird shift. And it's because, what we start out with, well, you did your AI thing and now you see that some of the AI stuff is crap. And name your version of crap. Is it unethical? Is it just AI slop and it's not really meaningful? Is it inaccurate? Is it risky? Like there's all kinds of flavors of yuck that's out there when it comes to AI. And I saw there was this post about the layers that we add in to make AI half decent, right? So you have all these fine-tuned models, you have maybe your own small language model that's in there, which is definitely a trend. If that's not coming up on people's radars, that's for sure the way a lot of people are going now. And just to be clear, doing a small language model means you need a really, really big size amount of data comparative for a traditional enterprise. But then you have RAG, and then you have graph RAG, and then you have verification, and you have all these different layers just to get to the same kind of sort of maybe it's okay output. And it's like, yeah, I think that the gains in the LLM space have gotten smaller and smaller. I mean, they're still big, don't get me wrong. We can now look at hands correctly. Apparently, we're at the pinnacle. Like I feel like I'm channeling Kurt here in some of your posts and your articles. We're at the pinnacle of modernity. We have 5 fingers and we can count them with AI. That's like such a Kurt thing to say. But like, okay, cool. Yes, these are great. We can solve math problems. We can do some of these other great things. But these are all still transformer based. When are we going to get to the next thing? Right. And I feel like that is the next thing a lot of people are going to be really looking at, in addition to a shift, not away from traditional like the LLM space, but hedging their bets, because LLMs are now having a lot more model drift. They have a whole lot more that they're ingesting that was originally AI generated. And so it's like that regurgitation issue. So eventually, there is that risk of model collapse. I don't think it's actually going to collapse. I think there's going to be like a set time where we're like, yep, this is pretty much as good as it's going to get. And if you don't need all the other bells and whistles, like, okay, that's fine. I can still tell you what Mariah Carey's birth date is. Like, that's always my, like, what silly thing is somebody going to ask today? That's fine. But if your entire business runs on now this AI thing that you have developed, you got to hedge your bets, and creating smaller language models, things that are not as dependent on any one model, is going to be a huge thing. It's already a trend, but I think it's going to be even bigger in 2026. And it's to reduce risk. I don't think it has anything to do with accuracy. I don't think it has anything to do with, gains of that sort. I think it's just like, hey, if your entire business is using ChatGPT on the back end, what happens if that gets really bad or something? I mean, nothing's going to happen to ChatGPT, I don't think. I mean, there's just too many people tied into it at this point. But you know what I mean? Like, it's a risk, and people are going to start to recognize that if they haven't already.
Well, I wrote an article recently. Originally, it started out talking about taxonomies, but the more as they tend to, the more I got into the article, the more I realized I'm not really talking about taxonomies here. I'm actually talking about something a lot more fundamental, and that was that I made the argument that we need to start thinking about a graph-first approach to AI. And the argument wasn't so much okay, can you do things with graphs by themselves that you can't do with AI? It's that it is a relatively simple proposition to be able to create essential graphs, if you will, that, or at least essential queries, that when you make them, their primary purpose is essentially to say, okay, I have a prompt and I'm going to take that prompt to basically determine closest match in my graph to this particular set of things, and use that essentially to drive the process, rather than what we currently have, which is basically, okay, we're using this unreliable, chaotic, inconsistent system to essentially manage orchestration. And that's insane. It's something where realistically, you want to be able to say, okay, if I'm going to create an orchestration layer, that orchestration layer needs to be solid. It needs to be something where you're saying, I need to be able to take care of security concerns. I need to take care of be able to look at it in terms of what is known versus what is conjectural. And so by shifting the cart before the horse rather than after, or shifting it after rather than before, which is the way I see it now, what that does is say, okay, start out with this basic presumption of I have a system that will allow me to identify nodes in a graph that I can then pass on into some kind of an AI model, into an LLM, to be able to work from that. And I would be willing to bet that probably will help reduce a lot, not all, but a lot of the problems that you see with LLMs themselves, because it's essentially saying, let's make sure that we have deterministic declarative processes at the get-go. And then if we need to elaborate upon them, that's where LLMs shine.
Mhm.
That's where you can do classification. That's where you can do,
Yeah.
okay, here's how I need to add information in that isn't necessarily immediately available within the graph. It also makes it a lot easier to handle one of the big problems that I have with graph rag, which is essentially I have to push the entire graph into a rag.
Mhm.
That's unreasonable because you don't have, when you start talking about all the combinatorics involved in even a small graph, you end up basically eating up your context pretty much like that.
Mhm.
And I think I think that the real challenge that you run into with that is that because you are essentially overburdening your context,
Yeah.
it means that you have much more difficulty in maintaining the system. If you can say basically, okay, this is the output that I'm looking to be able to pass on, then
Mhm.
all you're doing is passing in those nodes as output for some other process to then be able to take and work with.
And
So,
there's a lot of research in MCPs that are kind of alluding to that as well,
yeah,
right? Where if you make a bunch of tools for your MCP, it has to pick from thousands that you might have to offer. And that context window is crazy. But instead, you
yeah,
can make these services that are called, right? And in that case, it's doing very similar process to what you're describing, Kurt, where instead of front loading all that into context, you're actually doing some pre-processing essentially to get the right thing that you need, and then you pass that on in context, and it's faster. It stops the memory bleed, right? That happens when you have
mhm,
long multi-turn. So I think that even though some of the research that I was looking at on the MCP side wasn't talking about graph at all. I think it aligns closely with what you're talking about. And I
yeah.
think those are one of the other trends that we're going to see is like, how do you clean up and tighten up that context window or what you're putting into that context window?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the exact article, but there was a nice feature or nice thought about, well, when you look at 2026, it's the year that determinism. It's the year that the Empire Strikes Back. Um, it's basically, okay, we've gone as far as we can go with AI, and arguably on some respects, but you're talking about, I have AI generated things that are buttressing AI generated things that are buttressing AI generated things. And eventually you're talking about tens or hundreds of millions of tokens to be able to process something that could have been done with a deterministic approach for
Yep.
hundredth, a thousandth of the cost.
Yeah, over processing is a real big problem across the board.
Yeah.
I'm just seeing a lot of unthinking decision making going on based on historical patterns. Just not breaking out of the historical patterns. And so, I was looking at software as a service, which isn't going away. And basically, people are wedded to software as a service. They've got, the average enterprise may have 173 different SaaS subscriptions.
Mhm.
And so that's balkanization to begin with. And you're not hands-on with your workflow. So you're entirely dependent on a vendor to determine your workflow for you. It's just so much passivity that just gets in the way of getting anything done, because you've got all this stuff that you've bought that you feel like you have to use. And we talk about energy waste, but think about all the complexity that goes with 173 different SaaS applications just to get your work done.
That also reminds me of, the resource conversation about AI in general. And when we say AI, we're mostly talking about LLMs. I said this in a recent, I don't know if it was a podcast, it was an interview that I was in where somebody was talking about like what are the things that I'm most interested in or most excited about. Or, oh no, actually, they were asking me which LLM is best for writing Sparkle, which I don't ever use it 100% to write Sparkle. So I'm like, we'll just get a draft from any of them. It's fine. And then you have to do your own thing afterwards. But as part of that interview, I did mention that I try to use a lot of the same foundational models, the same LLMs, as much as possible. Of course, like some are better at different tasks than others. But I do that because I think that's going to be another thing that starts to gain popularity as a conversation, because the larger the proliferation of LLMs, they all are dealing with the same content. I mean, some of them have different stuff, don't get me wrong, and they all have, different ways of doing what they're doing. So that's why there are benchmarks. That's why you do have some models are better at different tasks than others. But at the end of the day, the more models you pick and use, the more of those resources you're using. And so what I'm trying to do, at least personally, is try to use a smaller amount of those things. And it kind of alludes to, I think, what you're saying too, Alan, is like, do you need 100,000 SaaS products? Do you actually need all of them? Or can you consolidate? Can you get something done? Maybe not the exact way you want, but you can do it in fewer turns or with fewer resources. At the end of the day, we all want to get our work done, right? And it's like, okay, what do you need? Well, as long as it's within budget, we can go with it. But I don't know, all of these SaaS services also have AI built into them, almost every single one. I was talking to somebody recently, and they're like, well, we need to make sure that there's no AI in these search engines before we interact with them. I was talking to somebody on LinkedIn about this, and I'm like, there's no such thing. Every search engine uses AI, every single one of them. So
well, you've got some sort of combinatorial explosion.
Yeah.
That's happening, that you're describing here, and it makes less and less sense the more it happens.
Well, I also think that and you kind of alluded to part of this. There was a big push in 23 through 20, it kind of has tapered off some in 25, and that was the AI can replace all your programs.
Yeah.
And fortunately, most of those are now crashing and burning. You look at what's going on with adoption. People are using AI not because they are looking to replace their headcount. Managers maybe, but most of the people that are actually working with it on a daily basis are doing it to augment their own skills. That fact, however, also means that in many respects, we're at a point where I think that AI, several things. I think that AI, first of all, is definitely post-peak. I think we have kind of reached that point where we're over the Gartner hump, and people are
sliding into disillusionment.
Sliding into disillusionment, and eventually it will, it will come back up. It will kind of get to the point where it is
stabilize.
infrastructure, and that's great. because I think that as infrastructure, it's the same thing as what SaaS was. It's the same thing as the whole cloud movement in general, and the whole shifting of analytics to broad platforms and so forth, in that it becomes infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And that infrastructure is something that we're now finally beginning to get at least a basic level of methodology around.
Mm-hmm.
And where can you use it? Where do you not use it? What things is it good at? What things do you never use within AI? And I think that's helpful. Now, a lot of the promotion is now kind of going, but we need to have AI everywhere. It's and fortunately, I think that is finally enough people are saying, yeah, right, okay. Not enough, perhaps, but
Yeah.
more and more, that's becoming the prevalent trend.
Yeah, I kind of feel like this is a kind of ties in when we're talking about infrastructure to some things that I saw Alan talking about yesterday.
Yeah, I like
Where
that.
yeah, so talking about like not just infrastructure, but what goes into these darn things and what are some of those trends, um, you know, seeing where investment is going from publication, from research, from AI itself. I have seen a lot of decrease in things, and I can get into, the specifics of it a little bit because I've been doing a lot of research into this. Um, One of the big things that AI obviously uses to pre-train, not just the open web, but open access research. And that goes into the funding that research institutions get and, all of those things that we know is decreasing. But on top of that, when you're doing open access publication, for instance, the way that works is your institution pays for you as a researcher to publish in that article. And they want to do that because one, your funding says, hey, you're using our taxpayer money funding to do this research. Therefore, taxpayers have to be able to find it and access it freely, right? So that's one reason. But it's also like you want to get your work out there in some of these journals that are used more often because they are open. But what happens if the funding dries up that your institution uses? They're not going to pay for you to put your stuff into open access journals anymore. And so we're seeing a trend of everyone starting to shift very slightly, actually not very slightly, pretty big, into more traditional journal publishing. Compounding this is people want to protect their actual content, their research from the AI because they know it's being used for that training. So like those two things specifically are starting to like really push things behind paywalls, unfortunately, for research. And so I know, Alan, you were talking about some, not exactly those themes, but those are the themes that I was kind of conjoining to what you were talking about. So can you go through a little bit about, for those that didn't see your article, what it was about?
Yeah. So if I could take a couple of minutes to paint the picture. For a time, I worked at the Office of Naval Research when I was in MBA school, and I worked for a whistleblower. And but there are 12 research universities in the U.S., and for some reason, historical reason, Office of Naval Research oversees the contracts and grants that go to those universities for basic research. So ONR has been overseeing this stuff since 1948. The thing about it is that we're dependent on this research for a lot of the key innovations that happen. So if you think about DARPA, for example, basic research created the internet. We had in Europe, we had CERN and the web. The human genome was sequenced at UC San Diego or whatever. You've got these research universities. It takes them 25 years to there's a long lead time for this stuff to pay off, but when it does, that's when commercialization can really take advantage of it. But there's this value that comes with all this research spending that the feds have been doing for many decades. And what I came across that I posted on was Congressional Research Service, their outlook for 2026 in terms of research spending. And a lot of the agencies that we're all really in tune with in terms of what they're coming up with, the innovations that they're coming up with, National Institutes of Health, HHS, et cetera, National Science Foundation, you're talking about a 30% cut. And they're cutting out stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense, of course. But there's just this anti-intellectual strain of how the cuts are being made, and at the same time, there's this whole bloviating going on about just unleashing AI. So it just seems to be contradictory to me, because we all know that the scientists are really plugged into structuring information. And pharmaceuticals, for example, the pharmaceutical concerns, they're all big into the ontological approach, the knowledge representation approach, because they have to be. They work at the molecular level. So, we're just totally supportive of the scientific angle on this. And if you're undermining the science by just closing down the funding, then you're just cutting off your nose to spite your face. So that was
Or
the whole.
Yeah, the funding is shifting though, right? Because
Yeah, it is.
yeah, there's some of the really, really big companies out there, they have whole science divisions, right? Like Google Labs, like they all have those. And I actually can't speak to whether those folks were also impacted by a lot of the big layoffs that happened this year. They could have been, for all I know. But that's where a lot of it's happening. And, there's only so much they can provide as far as their write-ups. Like they do present at conferences, they do publish their research, but they can only publish so much because, they work for a corporation and those corporations are doing their thing and they have to, protect some of their IP because that's their business. So, and I mean, that's not all of it, right? Like there's a lot of folks that are there are more startups now, I feel like, than ever before. And I know that's actually not true. Like a lot of startups go belly up very quickly nowadays, but I think that more people are going off on their own because of this weird tension that we're describing, right, Alan? Where there's like, okay, well, you're not going to get it on this side, and maybe you don't want to go and work for a big corporation. And so it's like, squoosh, what do you do, right? Like, well, I guess I'm going to go off on my own and do my own thing if I can find a way to make it a reality.
If you can get the funding.
If you can get the funding, right? Like you still, as a startup, you still need the funding.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge that I'm seeing right now. It's yes, there are a lot of startups right now, but a lot of those startups are basically extremely underfunded.
Yep.
A lot of them are basically bright kids.
Yeah.
And bright kids can do a great number of things.
Yeah, more power to them if they can make it work.
Yeah. And I think that what is happening, and this gets into a whole different area, because it's kind of what's happening in general to IT and related jobs, and what does that involve in terms of how is work itself evolving in that respect. But I think that the one key point about this is that we're watching as companies are basically, trimming any place they possibly can. But I also think that part of this challenge that you're running into is that these companies are watching as their predictable revenue streams drop.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening across the board. You know,
Yeah.
you hear about how companies have had great quarters and things like that, but what you're hearing about is largely great quarters, largely on the basis of what? It's not earnings. It's not, you know, you're not seeing you know, significant growth anywhere, and in many cases you're seeing significant, you know, drop-offs in terms of initial uh, initial revenue, and that in turn is part of what's now fueling this. Okay, we have to be meaner, we have to be leaner, you know, type of mentality. You know, companies are basically disintegrating. And I've said that before. They're becoming smaller. They're becoming less integrated. The fact that we're dealing with uh, dealing increasingly with a remote distributed workforce is also binding. You know, we're watching the dissolution of salaried positions and predictable income streams, and that's just having its resonance all throughout the industry. And you
Yeah.
know, with government not there to be able to provide a counterweight, um, I think that it's, you know, 2026 is going to be rough. 2027 may be rough
Well, and
because a
AI isn't
lot of these.
helping any of that.
No, I don't think it is. You know, I
No.
think I think we've there's been a lot of promises made that
Yeah.
won't ever be kept. And there's been a lot of expectation. And that's not to say that there isn't value, because there is. I don't think any of us disagree with that.
I can't tell
But
you
the
how many times
value
I've
is
talked to
overstated.
somebody and they say, "Oh, just throw some AI on that." And I'm like, "It's not a magic bullet. It costs money to do." So a
Mhm.
lot of companies, right? Like there's lots of research out there about like how many AI projects fail or don't return a investment. And it's like, I think that's one of the issues is for some reason, as soon as you put something on a board and it says AI, they think it's going to make them more money or it's going to be more cost effective, meaning you can get rid of, you know, certain headcount or something of those along those lines. And it's like, who do you think is training this? And when I say training, I'm not talking about training the AI, but you have to prompt it, you have to maintain it, you have to make sure it's on point, you have to make sure its cost doesn't go up or drastically down for some reason, and you're like, you know, maintaining something doesn't need to be maintained. There's all this stuff, and I don't really see a lot of people with good business plans on how is this AI thing
I don't
gonna
either.
make you more money for your company, right? And that doesn't always mean the AI itself is like the thing that people buy. It could be the AI is making something more effective and makes your product better, so people just want to like come and use it more often, whatever it might be. But it's like I think that's one of the big promises. Like AI is going to solve your problems from a business perspective, and really, it's just compounding what's out there, and that kind of goes into who's buying the AI stuff? Because, you know, I read some things recently that did not any one of them point this out. But when I put them together in my ontology brain, I kind of feel like, okay, so the majority of people that are using AI are those in offices, right? It's actually most people that are just doing it, using it for work. And it's not actually a lot of although students are using a lot of it, they're not the majority of people using it. And those are the people that have to then graduate and then use it. But if their jobs are now getting outsourced, again, I'm putting like air quotes around this because it's going to go away, right? Like you can't completely get rid of all the junior data scientist roles or all of the junior name your role because the AI can do it. Because if those kids, the students that are graduating who are using AI then don't get the job that uses AI the most in an office, then the people in the office are going to start to retire. Like there's this weird like what's going to happen with the circle? The circle is actually not connecting at the other end.
It's
And
not.
that's something that it's just too big and there are so many outlying factors in this that you can't distinctly point and say that's the problem. That's how you fix it. This is going to for sure happen. I think it's going to happen in pockets, and different industries are going to be affected more than others. But like, I think legal, if I had to put one out there, like I think legal is going to be one of those. Like, why do you need a paralegal if you've got AI to do all this stuff for you? But if the future lawyers are using it in university and they get out and they don't get the paralegal jobs, like the circle is no longer connecting anymore. And that I think adds to all of what we're talking about here, which is like AI is not going away. AI is incredibly useful in certain situations, but the over promising and making decisions, big decisions on those promises, I think there's going to be a big shift. I wouldn't say like this year early. I think maybe end of this year, you're going to start to see more of that. I just have that feeling like all the stuff that I see bubbling up. And because it's spread out all over the place and these like little connections, I just see it happening. It's going to happen either end of 2026 or into 2027.
Mhm.
I'm just going to say that what we're uncovering here, Ashleigh, is really a human problem. It's an organizational issue. And the more we try to automate, the more we try to use tooling to help us do things, the more we really have to evolve the organization. And
Yeah.
the organizational change just lags the technological change every time. So companies need to squarely focus on where to use humans the best,
Yeah.
and really put humans first in the equation.
Yeah.
And if they're not doing that, then nobody's going to get well served. You
Yeah.
know, and so we have these siloed organizations, and HR is just it's worse off than all the rest of them are.
Yeah.
Um, so they need the most help, and executives really need to tune into the problem and evolve those organizations so that people are aligned with what they're supposed to be doing and the way they need to be doing it.
I'd actually to further that point. Um, I tend to subscribe to a model that says that typically when you have an innovation, it takes about a decade for that innovation to truly make its way into an organization, for it to affect organizational structure. And so a lot of what we're seeing, sans COVID, which kind of threw a big wrench into every model out there, but sans COVID, has really been that we're now seeing largely the fruits of what happened with SaaS development and things like that in the mid to late 20 teens as what's driving a lot of organizations. So the thinking behind that is largely still very much SaaS oriented. What that means is that realistically by 2035, what we're going through now is going to have a huge impact upon what we think of even as what is a corporation, what is a company. Because I think that at that point we start getting into a stage where a lot of the paradigms that people today, that managers today working with organizations, are only now just beginning to grapple with, and that's going to take time to be able to percolate. And when it's done, I don't think we're going to recognize the landscape. I think that the impact of this into how do you do business is going to be profound, but it's going to be profound largely because at that stage, a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of symbolic versus neural based AI systems and all that, most of that will actually be in products, will be in methodologies, will be in services that essentially shape the organizations themselves.
Yeah.
I think that it's also going to basically change the very definition of what do we mean by a job.
Yeah.
And all of those we're now encountering, but we'll continue to encounter for the next 5 to 7 years.
Well, and here's the other thing, right? Like this sounds like this is just, such a catastrophic shift and all of these things. these
Not
shifts
really.
were starting before AI. Like they were. People were starting to work from home more often. People were doing more gig work, right? Like these are things that AI is just shining a light on, right? And has, sped up to a certain extent. And I think there's a lot of other areas where it's going to be very similar, right? Like nursing. You still need someone to come in and change your catheter. I'm sorry, my mom is a nurse, right? It's like can you get a robot to do that? I'm sure there's a lot of that that's going on. So I think if you want to look at what's the next cusp of where AI is going, it's got to be in the physicality of robotics and things like that, because there's the joke, like the wrapping on a building being developed. Okay, ChatGPT, build this building for me. It can't, right? But it could get a robot to do a lot of those things. And that goes into like other trends. Like I'm wide reading. I know you both are too. But housing shortage, right? And a big reason for that housing shortage is not necessarily because, of all the stuff going on with banks and mortgages. All of that, of course, has a role, but it's because the way we build houses is still not very automatic. And again, like this is not me saying it should be automatic, but I'm just quoting from others that are much more knowledgeable about this space than I am. A lot of robotics are now being used to try to speed those things up. Now, maybe the quality is going to be so horrible, nobody adopts it. Maybe it's going to be too expensive and it's going to be cost prohibitive. I have no idea. I don't work in that space. But I do feel like that is just adding to like, well, how do we bridge this? There was another post. I don't know if you both saw it. I thought it was funny, but it was also a really good commentary. There was an AI engineer, and he was talking about he was taking a flight from the West Coast to the East Coast, and halfway through his flight, they were having engine trouble. And then he said he whipped out his MacBook Pro, connected it into the onboard systems, used I don't know, Claude or something to, do troubleshooting on this aircraft to fix the engine trouble halfway through the flight. He not once did he say this was a joke. It's clearly a joke because it's not possible, right? But there were enough people that took it seriously. Like, you can't be serious. It's like, that's kind of the problem, right? Like, our disbelief of what AI can do has been so blown out of the water that there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. And not this person I'm talking about. He was actually making a joke and he made it clear in the comments. So I give him a pass and I give him a nod. That was funny. But for those that were also commenting on it, like as if it was serious, it's like there's a lot of stuff out there where it's still not possible for AI to do. And so if we get past what LLMs can do now and we get into more of the robotics, right? You have to then ask yourself, where's that line? Like, okay, you got a nurse and she's changing your catheter. There's that human, like back to what you were saying, Alan, there's a human element there. And sometimes I just don't want a robot to do that. There's a new movie coming out. I refuse to watch. I refuse to watch it. It has like Chris Pratt in it. It's about, do you know which one I'm talking about? Like someone decides that humans are too biased, and so they make the entire judicial system an AI. And of course, the AI is immovable. And Chris Pratt did not actually, do something to his wife or whatever it is in the movie. And he has to prove it to the AI. And I'm like, dude, this is the problem. This is like Terminator all over again. I love Terminator as a movie, by the way. But the point is, this is going to keep happening, right? More and more science fiction. But so many people don't realize it's really science fiction. And it's not even, a little bit. Well, maybe it is a little bit possible.
Well, there's so many things going on. There's a lot of factors and variables that you have to consider. And I've done a lot of forecasting over the years. And basically, you look at different regions of the world. Let's say you want to do demand forecasting, and you're looking at these different world regions to see where the uptake is going to be. In the US, for example, we have a huge amount of installed base. And so what that implies is that we're going to adopt EVs, for example, much more slowly than everybody else because we have so many gas-powered cars here. And people still driving their cars. They invested in them. They're going to be driving them for quite a while. So Ford's had to scale back its expectations of where the EV market is heading. Basically what this points to is that things change a lot slower, particularly in places like the US, than people think they will.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found myself as a forecaster often taking this S-curve of adoption and taking the endpoints and pulling it apart. So it takes longer. So it will take 30 years for this to happen. When are we going to reach penetration? It's going to be a lot longer than most people think it is. And so, you get all of this expectation about what AI is going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, you have to scale back your expectations quite a bit and just think about what's in the realm of the possible, given your circumstance and the factors that you're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think many companies are doing that kind of planning. They're just doing a knee-jerk reaction is what we're seeing from them.
Well, and it's hard. It's hard to figure that out. I think that's why they're hesitating.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Ellen on this. I think the job of being a forecaster, of trying to figure out what's the future going to bring, largely comes down to trying to marry where the technology is with the social implications and the social inertia that is part and parcel of that. And I think that in some respects, I look towards China right now as being, if you want to see where robotics is going, take a look at China.
Yeah.
In part because they have the ability to basically focus on, large scale systems, and, to a certain extent have the need for it. But I think that it also kind of points out, even there, where the societies are, how the societies are being impacted. And realistically, looking at that S curve, you have to kind of take into account the fact that, okay, these technologies still have to basically be accepted. It's a problem that I see with AI right now because unlike with previous trends where it was definitely, followed that logistics S curve that you're talking about, you're not seeing adoption at the same level as everyone was basically predicting. And in many cases, you're seeing regression, which is a bad sign. Because if you're seeing regression, it basically means that there's a lot of pushback right now societally on accepting these particular things because they do have such a huge impact. And with we still we need to get away from everyone basically taking Asimov and Heinlein and Clarke as being gospel. They were very good prognosticators for their time, but they were also still very much viewing the world from their perspective and looking at it primarily from okay, these are thought experiments. We don't have all the information. We can't have all the information. And I think that a lot of decision making is being done, especially on the technical side, on the basis of what we learned from our favorite authors as kids. And it's there's some real dangers in that because most authors are going to tell you, hey, this is not reality. This is basically fantasy. It's science fantasy, but it is still fantasy. And we need to acknowledge that when we're basically looking at how these technologies really will impact things.
It does help us. I mean, look at Star Trek. I'm a Trekkie, just saying. But you all can guess what shirt I wear in the comments when I go to Comic Cons. Yes, I also.
You're not a red shirt?
Oh no, I'm not actually. But now everyone has to guess. down in the comments. And what shirt should Kurt and Alan wear if they were Trekkies? But there's a lot of evidence that shows that things like that, shows like that were inspiration for a lot of the things that we have today. Like Alexa was inspired by computer, whatever, in Star Trek. And, if you looked at my Goodreads, you would see a whole lot of science fiction and dystopian future stuff too in my reading list. And, I do that because it does actually kind of help me think about these things in a very different way. And also cautionary tales, like that's where the dystopian future stuff comes in. But
And we're in the midst of early cyberpunk. I hate to say it, but yes.
Well, your background clearly shows that that's what we're doing.
Well, that's afterwards. Steampunk comes after cyberpunk. It doesn't come before.
Yeah, I mean, there's like different levels of it, right? And this is the thing, though. Like, I agree with what you're both saying about the length of time for true adoption, where it's in like the hands of most people. What I will say, though, is because I can hear some maybe in the comments or who are listening to this or watching this, well, AI is speeding up the amount of research that we can do and the amount of innovation we can do. And that's all true. However, where it falls over is, okay, cool, you can use AI to discover a new chemical compound, which is a true story, by the way, that nobody else has discovered. What did it take to get an AI system up to speed with all that data and that understanding of how to even do that? Took probably a monumental effort. And not only that, but how did you validate that finding? Yeah. There's all that to go with it. In addition to, and now what are you going to do with it? Right? And I feel like because this came on the scene so hot and so fast, there was those of us that have been in machine learning before that, which is good. But we were not even prepared for what was going on with this thing. And so I think going back to your processes and, your architecture and all these other like foundational things that we've been talking about, it's like that's the stuff that continues to have the adoption as not a flat curve, but a stretched out curve, because it's just so hard to get to that sweet spot. Yeah, and then if you do get to the sweet spot, what do you do with it is even harder.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you, but the tech people chase the shinies. They always have.
Yeah.
We've all been through this. I can't tell you how many times I've looked at the technology and say, that's really cool, I want to find out more about it. And then, once you actually get into it, you say, well, yeah, but you really do need to have foundations. You need to have good engineering, and you have good design and all of those other factors, but they're not exciting.
Yeah, they're not sexy.
They're not sexy. They're not going to be the things that a young up and coming programmer is going to look at and say, well, this will get me hired somewhere for big bucks.
Yeah.
I think that what's happening now is that you're getting the old farts coming in and saying, yes, but have you thought about this? And have you thought about that? Have you thought about security? Have you thought about consistency? Have you thought about provenance and data curation and all of those other things that you need to have before you can start talking about data products? And AI is a data product.
Yeah.
And it falls on deaf ears.
It does. But I would say the science fiction is an inspiration. It really is. And I'm always quoting William Gibson,
Yeah.
I'm always saying, the future is here. It's just less evenly distributed.
Yeah.
And what happens is that you have these pockets of adoption. The kinds of technologies we talk about, we see all kinds of pockets of adoption.
Yes.
But then, the real benefit comes when it's more than pockets. And so when does that happen? So that's when you have to be realistic, and you have to think about, it's kind of an 80-20 rule. 80% of the companies are really just going to be behind the 8 ball most of the time. And there might be 20% that are further ahead, and maybe only 1% that are really adopting in the way that you think they ought to.
I would actually take a different stance on that. I agree with you, like getting overall adoption does require it like to get out of those pockets. But I almost feel like when we talk about AI, we talk about it too generally. And it's easy to do because a general model, it's an LLM. It's the general stuff that you start with. But, I was just checking an article that I read this morning that was quoting that AI adoption with doctors is 67% use it daily, 84% say it makes them better doctors, 42% say it makes them want to stay in medicine, 10% said that makes them less inclined to stay in medicine. But the point is, that's a pocket. But maybe it's a really good pocket, right? Like AI is a tool. Don't get me wrong, there are some broad applications of AI that just make sense for most pockets, most disciplines. But I think there's other areas where there's just so much minutia for a certain thing in a certain discipline. And for some reason, like I'm not surprised in medical, there's so much open source, really good medical stuff out there. And there's a whole lot of bad hokum too. So you got to be careful. But, if you use some specific authoritative sources or, a lot of linked data sources that are out there, a lot of ontologies in the medical space, it's like, I'm not surprised that there's more AI adoption there. But just because the doctors are trusting it doesn't mean the patients are, right? So that's where we get into, well, is that a micro pocket, right? Like clinicians are good with it, but their patients aren't. Or let's say you're in pediatrics, maybe the kid's like, oh, that's cool. I can talk to Mickey Mouse when I, have to talk about which shots I have to take today or whatever it might be. But the parent is like, wait, my kid should not be working with AI when they're making decisions on whatever they need to do. I think that it often does just come back to that human aspect. Like, what are people going to trust? And should they?
I think that one of the things that I'm expecting from in 26 and 27 is that we're shifting away from this notion of AGI. We're shifting away from the notion that we need to create a generalized intelligence. That was the big push, primarily because not only was it a really cool goal, but it's also something that it allows for consolidation. And I think a lot of people are now having a lot of doubts about whether the value of that consolidation is worth the costs and the risks.
Yeah.
What I see happening instead in the AI space is that we're increasingly seeing ASI, we're seeing specialized intelligences, which to me is a much more realistic model about how intelligence should operate to begin with.
Context dependency, yes.
Yes. And because of that, it also basically means that as we're seeing those adoptions in here, your discussion about clinicians versus patients, a patient is basically going to look at it only from the perspective of, look, I want to know what's wrong with me, or how do I get better, or whatever. The clinician is basically the one that's doing the analysis, is basically making those tests. And what they need is not a general purpose tool. They need to have something that is essentially dedicated to a particular area, to be able to do diagnostics, to be able to do analytics, to be able to ensure that the kind of work that they're doing with the tools that they have, and AI is just one of many. I've been in enough hospitals over the last few years that I've watched very carefully. There's a lot of very interesting tools out there right now, but those are specialist tools. And the ones that are surviving are not going to be your general purpose AIs, the open AIs or whatever.
Yeah.
What's changing here is that now that we're moving into this mode of thinking about these as specialized intelligence across multiple nodes of networks with a mix of symbolic and neural intelligence systems all
Yep.
working together. And that's where I see this going.
Yeah.
That is to me where the next stages
Yeah,
of this whole
I
process are going to
completely
be.
agree. I completely agree. And I think that that's where knowledge graph and semantics shows up because it is context domain specific. And that
Yes.
includes to like, we were talking about world models. What about my world model as me as a human? Like I have a worldview. I have things that matter to me and things that don't matter to me when I'm working with an AI. Why wouldn't I want some of that context to be in play? Or I'm a company. I have a worldview. I have different things I care about, things I don't care about. There are things that I define differently than the rest of the world. Goodness knows we all work in alphabet soup most of the time. Like those are the things that people have been using knowledge graph for. And I think it's just going to continue to grow and get refined. And I've even seen, different ways to query, different ways to store it. Maybe you don't even need to store. Like there's all these different like tangential things to the semantic space that are starting to bubble up that they might not go anywhere, but I think they're intriguing conversations that it's just like, in the beginning of the year, you might see Fashion Week and there's certain things on the runway. And then eventually, when it gets to your local, like Walmart or wherever you go shopping for stuff, it looks like, if you really squint hard, like the thing, whether it's the color, the cut, whatever, the quality of materials, whatever it is, looks kind of sort of like the thing on the runway. But it's been merged and digested and moved around and cost cutting and all these things until it's fit for general use. And I feel like that's kind of what we're going to be doing, right? Like we're going to see like the cool stuff that's out there. And then in the graph space, we're going to synthesize that, figure out where it actually fits in, where is it the most beneficial. And it might kind of quasi look like the original thing. Like a good example of this is Kuzu was a graph database that wasn't a database, right? And I only recently learned, I did an honest review of them last year. Doesn't exist anymore. I think a different company called Ladybug has taken on their code base, but they were doing some really interesting things. And I'm sure Ladybug will do also really interesting things. And then others will pick up on some of those ideas. And then it'll show up in other vendors, right? I'm really curious to see what that's going to look like because I feel like because AI and different people are now getting involved in our semantic space, there's a really interesting amalgamation of different ideas coming in that I think is going to do us really a lot of good.
You make me think
Oh,
of the Samsung acquisition of
Yeah.
Oxford Semantic Technologies,
Yep.
and
Yep.
I thought it was a pretty smart idea to make that acquisition because Samsung's got access to all this phone real estate.
Yeah.
And speaking of domains, the personal domain is on the phone.
Yeah.
And you can give people sovereignty, quote unquote, data sovereignty, control over their own data in ways
Yeah.
that they really need to have it. I mean, it
Yeah.
needs that kind of control needs to be decentralized. The last thing we want is more oligarchy when it comes to data. So yeah, I think there are a lot of things like that, Ashleigh, that are promising. I'm going to look at what you were talking about because I didn't know the example.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here a little bit. I've been writing a series for the last month or so on SHACL. And I've gone from, well, this is kind of interesting to, oh my God, this is going to be pretty ground changing or groundbreaking, whatever the term is. And part of that is by itself, it's essentially a way of just talking about information structurally and schematically rather than inferentially.
Yeah.
And we can have arguments all day long about, what's the best type of database, RDFs, LPGs, whatever. But
We could spend all
ultimately,
day.
oh yeah, easily. But ultimately, I think that, what I find intriguing about SHACL is that what they're doing is saying, well, let's take a structural approach first in terms of how do we describe our graphs. And once we have that structure, we can start talking about UI. We can start talking about validation. We can start talking about inferencing and how do you build inferential systems and things like that. And I think that model, especially when combined with things like reification, are changing a lot of our preconceptions about how we think about what an ontology is and how it should be designed. And to a significant extent, a lot of that's being driven right now, not just from what's come past in terms of our symbolic, the RDF stack semantic web work, but also we're looking at AI and we're asking hard questions about, well, how exactly does an AI use the data that it uses? How do we tell it what is the best way to represent information? If you have a mechanism like SHACL, especially with the 1.2, where you can say, I can create a node expression, and a node expression essentially allows me to create computed nodes of information dynamically from the graph and effectively provide what amounts to a view of that graph that may be very different from what's underneath. That, I think, is going to be a very interesting and exciting piece of technology on the symbolic side that will start translating and filtering into other areas as well.
Well, if Kurt, you're working on something with that, please, if you could, write in something that abstracts it away so that other people can use it. Because anytime I've talked to anyone about SHACL and ontology constraints, their eyes go cross-eyed. So
Yeah.
That's the problem I have.
I just think that, and I hate these kind of terms, but I see 2026 as being the year of the ontology. I think
a lot of people have said that.
Moving into this mode of saying, okay, before we can talk about any kind of an AI system, we have to have some kind of a ground truth. We need to have some way of being able to ascertain this is the information as it is known, as it has been curated, and as it has been linked to and connected to others. I think it also basically will start opening up the possibility for linked data in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Yep.
Because we have a mechanism with MCP or other things to be able to actually start saying, okay, I want to be able to pull information from this source and this source and this source, and I don't want to have to be an expert to be able to do it.
Yep.
And that's becoming feasible now.
Yeah.
And
I think Upper Ontologies is going to help with that. As one
somewhat,
example.
yes, I agree with that.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of other, like I have, by the time people are watching this, it will already be posted, but I have an interview with Alex from Netflix on the UDA that's kind of trying to do a lot of that same stuff, right? Which is like, okay, I want to be able to find content and information, and I don't want to be an expert in any of it, and I want to be able to play around with whatever I need when I need it. So that will be up already for anybody that is interested in that. But yeah, I agree with you, Kurt. I think I've heard a lot of people say year of the graph, year of ontology specifically. And I think it has a lot to do with, there are these different forms of what is a graph and what do I want to use it for? Because there's the analytics, there's query expansion, there's enterprise knowledge so I can get to the bits and pieces where I need it all across my organization or other organizations that connect into me. There's obviously, verification and entity resolution. Like there's so many ways you can use graph. And by the way, all the things I just mentioned, they're not one graph. Those are different types of graphs. And I think that we're going to get more interest in the nuances of all of that in this next year too. So I would totally agree with you.
Yeah, and I would just add that maybe the focus could be squarely on making these ontologies functional and usable with the help of automation, and just really trying to unpack how would we make these things the most usable that they can be, with these methods that we've all tinkered with and know about, but they're not accessible. So there's a way to make AI our partner in unpacking all of that stuff, so others can take advantage of it.
And knowing what you're looking at, right? Because I know we talked about GraphRag and other approaches. Like, hey, I'm not knocking it. You can use it, but know what you're getting into, know how to use it appropriately, just like any other tool in the semantic AI toolbox, right? And so those are, some of the big topics coming up in 2026.
Curated and governed, but you're using automation to help you with that.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both. I always have such a good time talking to both of you. This one will also be up on where you can get podcasts and stuff. I don't know if you guys knew that. I do have a podcast connected to the YouTube channel, but I just take the videos I do that are more like chit-chatty and I put them on there. So